Super Mario RPG is probably one of the strangest games to come into existence, as it brought Nintendo's mascot Mario into his first RPG. Luckily, Nintendo had some help in converting Mario into an RPG action star from Square, which was known at the time for creating the ever-popular Final Fantasy series, Chrono Trigger, and Secret of Mana. Super Mario RPG is remembered fondly by fans for its at the time advanced graphics, unique characters, and interesting story. But considering that this game is 17 years old, does it still hold up today? The story starts in traditional Mario fashion with Bowser kidnapping Peach. Mario rushes off to save the princess, but just as he's about to save her, Smithy crashes down into Bowser's Keep, destroying Star Road in the process, leaving it up to Mario and friends to find and collect 7 stars in order to rebuild Star Road. Now obviously there's more to the story than just that, but the problem is most of what happens in the game has little to do with the overarching plot. Other than briefly mentioning how without Star Road no one's wishes will come true, and having a few instances where Smithy's goons get in your way, most of what happens in the game is pointless. For example, the sessions with Booster and Valentina are largely wasted, considering that neither have a star in their possession, and neither are connected to Smithy. This begs the question as to why they're even in the game at all if they weren't going to be connected to the main plot. I mean, sure, you meet up with Peach again through Booster, and Valentina held Mallo's parents hostage, but I just don't understand why they both didn't have stars, and why you were forced to go through another area after beating both of them to get the star. Smithy himself is also barely present or mentioned in the game. In most other RPGs, you're aware of and meet on several occasions the final enemy, and over the course of the game, they become bigger and bigger threats. That's not the case in Mario RPG, as the game just basically says that Smithy wants to take over the world using the stars, and then nothing. He doesn't destroy towns or directly fuck with any other people or your party. His minions do, but it's kinda hard to really care about Smithy, when there really isn't a reason to care about him other than the fact that we're told we should care. Now I get that Nintendo is very family friendly when it comes to Mario, so it's not like they could have Smithy wipe out a village of toads by poisoning them, or burn down a village filled with Koopas. But a little more interaction with Smithy through the game would have gone a long way to making him feel like a threat. Interaction between Mario and his allies is also sparse, as there's really not any characterization of or between them. The only 2 characters that have any semblance of story and growth are Mallow and Bowser, as Mallow has a story arc where he finds his parents, and Bowser is seen in a much more comedic light than the big bad brute of the Super Mario Bros. Series. But Peach and Geno have very few scenes where they have dialogue, and Mario is a silent protagonist, so most of his speaking is done through slapstick humor and pantomime. That being said, Bowser and Mario and Mallow have their moments of being funny, but overall the characters are largely forgettable. Design-wise, Super Mario RPG was ahead of its time. Like Donkey Kong Country, Super Mario RPG had 3D generated environments and sprites that made the game appear to be in 3D. The isometric view of the game also added to the 3D effect, providing areas with a sense of depth. However, although the game looked to be ahead of its time, these design choices also hindered the game in a few ways. For example, for some reason the developers thought it would be a good idea to include platforming elements, because of the fact that Mario was traditionally known as a platformer. However, because of the isometric view, it's incredibly difficult to accurately jump between platforms. For instance, it took me forever to jump between these beanstalks. I mean, just by looking at them, they appear to be right next to each other, so you'd think you'd be able to just jump left, but apparently not. There's just no way of knowing if they're in the foreground or background, or if they're in the same plane of existence as the one you're on. Next, later on there are several segments where you're required to jump between moving platforms over lava, and if you fall in, you're sent back to the beginning of the area. And again, it's difficult to tell where exactly the platforms are in conjunction to you, which is made worse by the fact that you have to jump diagonally to reach them, which in and of itself is awkward. This problem also rears its head in the puzzles and minigames found in the game. Most of the puzzles aren't that difficult to understand what you're supposed to do, but the perspective in the game fucks with your head, which makes controlling some of them to be next to impossible. One of the puzzles is this god-awful 3D puzzle, where you basically have to move Mario through this 3D maze, except you can't see anything, and you just have to blindly move and jump in order to make your way to the top. Another involves jumping over barrels like in the original Donkey Kong, but again, because of the perspective, it's difficult to judge when to jump. Now, even though some puzzles are difficult to control, for the most part, they're not too bad, and can be figured out with a little bit of trial and error. The game also makes it pretty obvious what you're supposed to do, or at least gives you hints on how to solve them if you miss something. The minigames, on the other hand, are downright awful. At their best, the minigames are tedious endeavors that require you to repeat them until you understand how to go about them, but at their worst, they're so frustrating you want to stab yourself in the head. I can honestly say that I found none of them to be fun or worth repeating, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the isometric view in the game just makes some of them unplayable. Like this whack-a-mole game where you have to jump on Goombas. Instead of just having to point in a direction and hit the jump button to hit the Goombas, here you have to physically move Mario over one of the pipes in order to jump on them, and hope they don't disappear before you can hit them. The minigame pretty much just boils down to luck, as you don't have enough time to move to another pipe before the Goombas disappear. So you have to pray that a lot of Goombas pop out of the one you're standing near. Not only that, but it's hard to judge how far you need to jump to actually hit them, seeing as how sometimes when I jumped, I missed and landed on the rim of the pipe. Then of course there's this terrible minecart raceway maze bullshit, which is next to impossible to control, considering that every time you round a corner, unless you slow way the fuck down, you'll fly off the tracks and spin out. To top it all off, the rewards for completing these minigames are usually only a handful of coins, one frog coin, or if you're lucky, a flower tab, which isn't even worth the effort of playing these minigames in the first place. The battle system in Mario RPG is the standard turn-based system with a little twist. Like most turn-based RPGs, characters and enemies' actions take place depending on their speed, with faster characters getting the opportunity to attack before slower ones. In most cases, it can be pretty boring to just sit there and wait for your turn, but Mario RPG introduced the concept of timed button presses, where pressing a button at a certain time during the attack animation would allow your attacks to deal more damage. You could also use time button presses during enemies' attacks, which would reduce the amount of damage you would take. The problem with time button presses, though, is that you have to figure out the right moment to hit the button on your own. Most of the time, it's not too hard to figure out, as sometimes there's a lull in the character's animation, which would indicate that you can continue the attack. But when using special attacks, it's a little hard to tell when exactly you're supposed to do it. Another problem is that although you can use time button presses when an enemy uses a physical attack against you, you can't when they use a special attack. And seeing as how most of the time enemies will use special attacks against you, it makes the concept of blocking attacks kind of irrelevant. Even though the time button presses are supposed to make battles more engaging, to me they just drag battles out even longer than they were before. Since you need enough time to hit the time button presses, attacks seem to be a lot slower and attack animations are a lot longer than in most games. Add to the fact that after a while, hitting the same fucking button over and over again just to do a stronger attack is more annoying than just choosing a character's action and letting them attack automatically. There also seems to be little to no consistency on how much damage an attack can do. Most of the time, I never knew if an attack was going to do enough damage to outright kill the enemy, or just enough so I had to spend another turn attacking them. This is kind of the main problem I have with the combat system in the game, as you never know if an attack is going to one-shot an enemy, even if you've been lucky enough to kill them in one hit before. You may not always get the same results. And it's not like similar enemies have different stats or attributes among themselves. The problem is that attacks have inconsistent damage outputs, depending on whether or not you manage to hit the time button presses. And even if you do hit them, sometimes they'll randomly do more or less damage than you normally would for absolutely no reason. For an RPG, there really isn't any grinding in a sense, as if you just fight the enemies you encounter on your way to your goal, you should be able to handle any situation without having to backtrack and go through areas again. That being said, it seemed like you had to defeat a shit ton of enemies just to level up, considering enemies provided an incredibly low amount of experience, no matter how difficult they were. However, one thing I like about the experience system is that everyone gets experience when you beat an enemy, not just the characters in your party. That way you don't have to spend time switching and leveling up other characters, or having two characters who are way lower in level compared to everyone else, therefore becoming completely useless. Speaking of characters, there are 5 playable characters: Mario, Mallow, Geno, Bowser, and Peach, and when you're not in battle you can freely switch between them. However, for the most part I pretty much stuck with the same 3 characters for the whole game, considering that they had the highest attack, as it was just easier to use brute force to beat every enemy than fuck around with magic, especially since everyone shared the same pool of magic points. Initially you have 10 magic points, but you can get up to 99. Of course, between 3 characters you can quickly deplete the amount of magic you have, considering that strong attacks use around 12 to 15 points per attack. So unless you want to constantly waste a turn recovering flower points, it's not really worth the endeavor. Not only that, I would say that the only useful magic was recovering health and Geno Blast or Flash, and even then, using just those would drain your magic quickly. And considering that most magic is weaker, or at best just as strong as physical attacks, also doesn't help. And although I know this wasn't a staple at the time, if I'd had the option of switching characters during battle, I think I would have used Mallow and Peach more often. But usually, it just seemed like I didn't have time to prepare to switch before I ended up running into a boss, or I just forgot. Besides, most of the time if I needed to heal my characters, I would just switch them outside the battle, heal up, and then switch back. And the only time I really needed a dedicated healer in the team was at the end of the game. One cool thing about the game is that there are a lot of secrets and Easter eggs. Square included a lot of little nods to other Nintendo franchises, as well as a few nods to their own that can be found throughout the game. For example, through a series of events, you can gain access to an optional boss, which is reminiscent of a Final Fantasy boss, and during the boss fight, the Final Fantasy IV boss music plays, which is pretty cool. There are also a few side quests that reward you with better weapons or equipment. So taking everything into consideration, is this game overrated? Yeah, I think so. Considering the time it was released, I can see why and how this game became sort of a cult classic, as it was completely new and unique for a Mario game. The game also introduced a new battle system not seen in many RPGs up until that point. But that being said, I think the Paper Mario and Mario & Luigi series have improved upon the mechanics introduced in Mario RPG. In both series, combat feels faster and more fluid, with a variety of different button presses and actions used to pull off stronger attacks, instead of just hit A at the right moment. Not only that, but the characters as well as the villains have become more fleshed out and memorable compared to Smithy. Of course, that's not to say that Super Mario RPG is a bad game. It's a perfectly enjoyable experience, but after 17 years, the game has started to show its age.